Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going way back to ancient India, specifically the 6th to 4th century BCE. It was the time of the Buddha.
A fascinating period.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll
Yeah.
be exploring, those core teachings of Buddhism and how they really kind of shook things up, socially, culturally. And for this deep dive, we're actually using, excerpts from our previous episode on the Vedas
Ah, yes.
and a book. It's about the British in 18th century Bengal.
Might seem a little unexpected, this pairing.
Yeah.
But trust me, the book, it's Ideology and Empire in 18th Century India
Okay.
by Robert Travers. It really sheds light on how Buddhist teachings were interpreted and even utilized much later. So, yeah, it gets pretty fascinating.
All right, well, let's set the stage then. Ancient India,
Yeah.
time of huge transition. Think moving from like nomadic life to settled agriculture.
Yeah.
And we learned in our deep dive on the Vedas that the hymns, they kind of reflected these anxieties about this shift. Isn't it interesting how Buddhism emerged from the same like context of societal upheaval?
It is. And what's really fascinating is how Buddhism offers this completely different response, right, compared to those Vedic traditions. The Vedas, I mean, those foundational texts composed over centuries with their hymns, prayers, philosophical insights, huge influence on Indian culture.
Right, with the four parts.
Yeah.
The Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharva Veda.
Exactly. Each with their own specific focus. And they explore, these really big concepts like Brahman, that's the ultimate reality, and Atman, the individual self or soul.
Right.
Talk about dharma, duty and righteousness, karma, the idea of actions and their consequences. And they even, touch upon the origins of the caste system, although in a much more fluid form, of course, than what it later became.
So we have this Vedic foundation, and then Buddhism comes along and says, hold on, we're going to challenge the authority of the Vedas and the Brahmanical priesthood. That's a bold move, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Buddhism offers this really radical alternative, not just to religious authority, but to the entire social order, including challenging that emerging caste system rooted in the Vedic worldview.
And that's where things get really intriguing for me. Like, how did Buddhism provide this alternative? Can you explain the Four Noble Truths, maybe in a way that helps us connect with, like, the heart of this new way of thinking?
Okay, so the first noble truth, it states that life is suffering, or dukkha. Now, this doesn't mean that life is all doom and gloom, but it acknowledges that impermanence is kind of woven into the fabric of existence. And this leads to a sense of dissatisfaction. We crave things, we fear losing things, and that's suffering in a nutshell.
I see what you mean. It's like that feeling of always wanting something more, something different.
Yeah, exactly. And the second noble truth kind of builds on that. It says that suffering arises from attachment or tanha. We cling to things, ideas, even our own identities. And that creates this cycle of craving and aversion. You crave pleasurable experiences, push away unpleasant ones, and both actually lead to suffering.
So our desires and aversions actually fuel our suffering. That's a pretty profound insight.
It is, and that leads us to the third noble truth, which offers a path forward. Suffering ceases when attachment ceases. And this is the state of nirvana.
So nirvana isn't about, like, escaping to some heavenly realm, right?
Exactly. It's about liberation from this cycle of craving and aversion. Imagine a state of deep inner peace and contentment, regardless of your external circumstances, a state of freedom.
That sounds incredibly liberating. But how do we even begin to approach such a state?
That's where the fourth noble truth guides us. It states that the path to the cessation of suffering is the Eightfold Path. And this is a practical guide to living a more mindful and ethical life.
Okay, the Eightfold Path. I'm guessing this isn't just like a list of rules to follow, is it?
Not really, no. It's more like a roadmap for cultivating wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Think of it as a way to train your mind and actions, and it all starts with right understanding. That's seeing the world through the lens of the Four Noble Truths.
So understanding that suffering exists, seeing how it arises, and recognizing that there's a way out.
Exactly. And from that understanding flows right thought, cultivating wholesome thoughts of loving kindness, compassion, and nonviolence. So instead of being consumed by greed or aversion, you shift your mindset to one of kindness and understanding. And this shift in thinking then translates into action.
I'm starting to see how each step kind of builds upon the previous one.
Exactly. Speech emphasizes speaking truthfully, kindly, in a way that promotes understanding and harmony. Right? Action is about acting ethically, avoiding harming others, basically aligning your actions with your understanding of those Four Noble Truths.
What about the next step on the path?
Right. Livelihood. choosing a way of making a living that doesn't harm yourself or others. This was actually a pretty radical concept at the time, challenging people to really consider the ethical implications of their work.
Right, livelihood. That's a concept that still resonates today, especially with all the ethical questions around certain industries.
Absolutely. And then we move to the more internal aspects of the path, right effort. It's about actively cultivating wholesome qualities and abandoning unwholesome ones. It's about intentionally shaping your mind and actions.
Okay.
Right? Mindfulness is about paying attention to the present moment without judgment.
So instead of being lost in thought about the past or worried about the future, it's about being fully present in the now.
Yes. And finally, right concentration, developing focused attention, which helps us cultivate those deeper states of peace and insight.
It's amazing how each aspect of that Eightfold Path, it kind of supports and reinforces the others. It's really a comprehensive approach to, like, personal and spiritual development, isn't it?
What's important to remember is that it's a journey, not a destination. It's about continually striving to live in accordance with these principles, knowing that there will be setbacks along the way.
So it's a practice, a way of life, rather than a rigid set of rules to follow perfectly.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Eightfold Path wasn't just about individual liberation. It was about creating a more just and compassionate society.
So how did Buddhism, with its Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, actually influence, like, social values and challenge that existing social order? How did these teachings actually play out in everyday life?
Well, one of the most radical things Buddhism did was challenge the caste system directly. I mean, its emphasis on compassion, nonviolence, and the inherent worth of all beings was completely at odds with that rigid hierarchy of the caste system. It offered a path to liberation that was open to everyone, regardless of their social standing.
That's incredibly revolutionary, especially in a society where your worth was largely determined by the circumstances of your birth.
Right.
Buddhism essentially said, no, everyone has the potential for enlightenment.
That's right. And this message of inclusivity was particularly powerful for women. Think about it. Buddhism offered them a way out of traditional roles that often confine them. They could join the Sangha, devote themselves to spiritual practice, and achieve a level of independence that was basically unheard of at the time.
So the establishment of monastic communities, or Sanghas, provided an alternative to traditional family structures and social roles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Sangha itself, it was like a model for a more egalitarian society. Monks and nuns lived together, supported each other, and worked together for the common good.
It's like a mini society within society built on those principles of equality and cooperation.
Precisely. And this is where things get even more interesting. So let's fast forward to the 18th century. We have this book by Robert Travers about the British in Bengal. And you might be wondering, how does this connect to ancient Buddhism?
To be honest, it does seem like a bit of a leap at first.
What's fascinating is that Travers argues that the British, even as colonizers, they engaged with and tried to understand indigenous systems of knowledge.
So they weren't just imposing their own ways of doing things. They were actually trying to learn from Indian culture and traditions.
Not entirely, of course. But Travers explains how the British, in their efforts to legitimize their rule in Bengal, they thought to understand the Mughal system of government as an ancient constitution. This involved researching Mughal history and legal traditions, which were themselves influenced by centuries of interaction with Buddhism and other Indian philosophies.
So the British were digging into India's past to try to understand its present. That's a really interesting approach, especially considering their role as colonizers.
And this quest for an ancient constitution, it actually resonates with Buddhism's emphasis on understanding the past, its causes, and its effects. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of everything. It's fascinating to see how these ideas travel across time and cultures.
Okay, now I'm starting to see the connection. So even though the British were coming from a completely different culture, worldview, they were still grappling with some of the same questions about governance, legitimacy, and history that were explored in ancient Buddhist teachings.
Exactly. It highlights how ideas can travel across time and cultures in sometimes unexpected ways.
It's mind-blowing to think about those connections, especially given the vast differences between ancient India and 18th century colonial Bengal.
Absolutely. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've only just begun to explore how the British engaged with this idea of an ancient constitution. Their exploration had a significant impact on their approach to governing India.
This is where it gets really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Let's dive deeper into how the British attempted to understand and utilize this concept.
Okay. But before we do, let's just take a moment to kind of reflect on what we've learned so far. What stands out to you about the core teachings of Buddhism and how they offered this radical alternative to the existing social order?
Well, what strikes me is how Buddhism, it emerged during this time of profound change and offered a path focused on inner transformation as a response to societal upheaval. It's fascinating how these teachings resonated with people and, led to these significant cultural shifts.
You're right. It's like they were saying, okay, the world's changing, we need to change with it, but the real transformation needs to happen like within ourselves.
Yeah.
But let's get back to those British in Bengal.
Yeah.
They were interested in this ancient constitution, right?
Yes. And this idea, it played a really crucial role in how they tried to legitimize their rule.
But how did they go about understanding this ancient constitution? What sources were they even looking at?
Well, one of the most important sources they relied on were the writings of Mughal historians.
So they were digging into like actual historical accounts written by people within the Mughal Empire. It wasn't just speculation or like secondhand
And
interpretation.
exactly. They were particularly interested in texts that described, the structure of the Mughal government, its laws, its administrative practices.
It sounds like they were trying to like create a guidebook to Mughal governance, almost like a Mughal for Dummies manual.
In a way, yes. They wanted to understand how the Mughal system worked so they could figure out how to fit themselves into it, or at least how to use elements of it to legitimize their own authority.
I can imagine that trying to like decipher these Mughal texts must have been quite a complex task.
It was, and it's important to remember that the British, they didn't always understand these texts perfectly or interpret them objectively. They brought their own biases and assumptions to the table.
Right, they were looking at another culture through their own lens, trying to find things that made sense to them. I wonder if they were even able to recognize the aspects of Mughal governance that might have been like influenced by Buddhist thought.
That's a great question. It's certainly possible that some of the Mughal practices that they observed had roots in, Buddhist ideas about governance, social justice, even economic systems. We know that Buddhism had a profound impact on Indian culture, so it's very likely that some of those influences found their way into the Mughal Empire.
Do we have any examples of how their own ideas might have influenced their interpretation of the Mughal system?
Well, one key area where this played out was in their understanding of property rights.
Property rights, that seems like a pretty fundamental concept.
It is, and the British had very specific ideas about how property should be owned and managed, coming from a system of, private land ownership. They were particularly intrigued by the Mughal concept of zamindars.
Zamindars, can you just remind us who they were?
Zamindars were essentially intermediaries between the Mughal state and the peasants. They were responsible for collecting taxes from the peasants and passing them on to the Mughal government.
So did the British just like assume that zamindars were basically like English landlords?
Not exactly. There was a lot of debate about the precise nature of zamindari rights. The British, they tried to understand this system through their own framework of land ownership, which wasn't always a perfect fit.
So even though they were trying to understand this ancient constitution, there's still a lot of room for interpretation and disagreement.
Absolutely. The British were constantly arguing amongst themselves about what the Mughal system actually meant and how it should be applied to their own rule. They were trying to, you know, fit a square peg into a round hole, so to speak.
It sounds like their efforts to understand the Mughal system were a bit of a mixed bag.
Hmm.
You know, they were genuinely curious about how things worked, but they were also trying to find ways to, like, legitimize their own rule, which
Yeah.
probably colored their perceptions.
You hit the nail on the head. And this led to some unintended consequences as they tried to incorporate what they learned into their own administration of India.
What kind of consequences? Give us an example of how this played out.
One example is their approach to legal reform. The British, they were faced with the challenge of administering justice in a society with, diverse legal traditions, including Hindu and Islamic law. Initially, they tried to incorporate elements of these existing legal systems into their own administration.
So they weren't just, like, imposing British law wholesale. They recognized the need to engage with these existing legal frameworks.
Yes, and this is where the idea of the ancient constitution came into play. They believed that by studying Mughal law, they could identify principles that aligned with their own ideas of justice. It was like they were trying to find common ground between British and Mughal legal
It's
traditions.
like they were trying to create a hybrid system that blended the best of both worlds. at least from their perspective.
Exactly. And they used Mughal precedents to create new courts and procedures, especially in the realm of criminal justice. But remember, this blending, it wasn't always a smooth process.
I can imagine there were some clashes between British and Mughal ideas about crime and punishment. Those are pretty fundamental aspects of any legal system.
You're right. And the British often had to make adjustments to Mughal law to fit their own understanding of justice. It was a delicate balancing act. They were trying to respect Mughal traditions while also asserting their own authority.
Did they manage to, like, strike that balance? Or did their reforms end up creating more tension?
Unfortunately, their efforts often led to conflict and resentment among Indians, who felt that their own legal traditions were being undermined. The imposition of British ideas, even when blended with Mughal elements, it created this sense of cultural dissonance.
So, in a way, their attempt to engage with the ancient constitution, it backfired.
In some ways, yes. It highlights the complexities of colonial rule and the challenges of trying to reconcile different cultural and legal systems. Even when they were trying to be respectful of Mughal traditions, the British were ultimately driven by their own interests, their own beliefs.
This makes me think about how history can be this powerful tool. But it can also be used in, like, different ways. Sometimes it's used to illuminate the present, but other times it's used to, like, distort it.
That's a brilliant observation. And in the case of British India, it seems like history was often used to legitimize the illegitimate. They were fascinated by this ancient constitution, but they weren't always willing to fully embrace it on its own terms. They were looking for elements that would support their own rule, rather than trying to understand the Mughal system in its entirety.
It's like they were cherry-picking the parts of history that suited their agenda.
Which is a bit disheartening.
Yeah.
Did this selective approach to history influence other areas of British policy besides legal reform?
Absolutely. Another key area was revenue administration.
Revenue administration. That sounds a bit dry.
It might sound dry, but it was like the lifeblood of the colonial state. Revenue was essential for funding the administration, the army, all their activities in India. And so they were very keen to understand how the Mughals had collected revenue. So they went back to those Mughal texts again, trying to figure out the financial secrets of the empire.
They did. They studied Mughal revenue records, consulted with Indian officials who had experience with the Mughal system. It was like they were doing a financial audit of the Mughal Empire.
What were they hoping to learn from all this?
They wanted to understand, how the Mughal system worked, how much revenue they'd collected, how they assessed and collected it. Basically, they were trying to identify the most efficient and effective ways of, well, extracting revenue from the land.
And I bet they saw the ancient constitution as a way to, like, justify their own revenue demands, right?
Exactly. They argued that by following Mughal precedents, they could ensure a fair and equitable system of revenue collection. They were trying to present themselves as legitimate rulers, upholding the ancient rights of the state as established by the Mughals.
Fair and equitable, coming from a colonial power. That's a bit ironic, wouldn't you say? Were their revenue demands actually fair to, the Indian people?
That's a matter of debate. The British revenue demands were often very high, and they led to hardship for many Indian peasants. So you could argue that their use of this ancient constitution was a way of masking their own economic interests.
It sounds like they were trying to, like, have it both ways, appealing to tradition while also maximizing their profits. Classic colonial tactic.
It's a common theme in colonial history, the attempt to reconcile economic exploitation with a veneer of legitimacy. And this idea of the ancient constitution, it provided that veneer, allowing them to claim that they were upholding the established order rather than imposing something new.
But as we've seen, their interpretation of that ancient constitution was often selective and self-serving. They weren't truly interested in, like, preserving Indian traditions. They were interested in power and profit.
That's a fair assessment. Their use of this ancient constitution was ultimately about serving their own interests rather than those of the Indian people.
It's a fascinating and somewhat cynical story, seeing how these ideas about the past were used to, like, justify colonial domination. We started with Buddhism, offering this radical alternative to the existing social order, and now we see these ideas being appropriated centuries later by a colonial power to solidify its own control.
It's a reminder of how history can be a double-edged sword. It can be used to illuminate the present, but it can also be used to distort it.
And in the case of British India, it seems like history was often used to legitimize the illegitimate. The British were initially interested in understanding Mughal law and governance, but their primary goal was always to establish their own dominance, wasn't it?
That's right. Their interest in the ancient constitution was ultimately a means to an end, and that end was the creation of a British empire in India.
It's fascinating how an exploration of Mughal history, which itself was likely influenced by Buddhist thought, became a tool for like colonial expansion. But I'm curious, did this fascination with the ancient constitution continue? Or did British attitudes change as their power in India grew?
It's an interesting point. As British power in India grew, their need to rely on the ancient constitution for legitimacy, well, it kind of diminished.
So they became more, I guess, confident in their own authority and less concerned with like justifying their actions through these Mughal precedents.
Exactly. They no longer felt this need to seek approval or legitimacy through the lens of the past.
Did they just like abandon this idea of the ancient constitution altogether?
Not entirely, no. It still lingered in their, rhetoric and speeches, but it definitely became less prominent in their actual policies.
So if they weren't using this ancient constitution to justify their rule, what took its place?
They increasingly emphasized this idea of, well, British superiority, arguing that British law and institutions were inherently, superior to those of India.
It sounds like a classic case of colonial
It
arrogance.
was. They genuinely believed they had a duty to civilize India, to bring it into the modern world, but according to their own standards, of course.
And that meant imposing their own values and systems on the Indian people, regardless of the rich and complex traditions that already existed.
Unfortunately, yes. They introduced Western education, reformed the legal system, and implemented new policies designed to, modernize Indian society, all based on their own worldview.
So the idea of the ancient constitution, which initially served as a way for the British to kind of legitimize their rule, was eventually overshadowed by a more, I guess, assertive and domineering approach to colonialism.
That's a great summary. As the British became more powerful, they felt, well, less of a need to accommodate Indian traditions and more confident in imposing their own vision.
It's a bit of a tragic story seeing how this initial interest in Indian culture and history, even if it was partly, self-serving, gave way to a more blatant form of imperialism.
It is. It reminds us of the complexities and contradictions inherent in colonialism, how an attempt to understand another culture can ultimately lead to its suppression.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the origins of Buddhism and its radical challenge to the social norms of ancient India to the British Empire's later attempts to use and even manipulate those same ideas for their own purposes. It's incredible how these threads weave together across centuries.
It really highlights how interconnected history is and how ideas can have this ripple effect across time and cultures, sometimes in the most unexpected ways.
It makes you wonder how much of what we consider new or modern is actually rooted in ancient wisdom or practices that have been, reinterpreted or repurposed over time.
That's a thought-provoking question. It challenges us to look deeper into the origins of our own beliefs and systems to see what influences from the past might be shaping our present.
And perhaps to consider how we might be unconsciously repeating patterns from history as we navigate the complexities of our own time.
Precisely. By understanding the past, we can gain a clearer perspective on the present and make more informed choices about the future.
What a journey. We started with ancient India and ended up in 18th century colonial Bengal, all thanks to the enduring legacy of Buddhist thought. It's amazing how these teachings continue to resonate even today, offering insights into human nature, suffering, and that path to liberation.
Absolutely. And while the British may have, distorted or even misused some of these ideas for their own purposes, those core principles of Buddhism, compassion, nonviolence, and the pursuit of wisdom, they remain powerful and relevant in our own time.
Here's a final thought for you as you continue to explore these ideas. How can we apply the wisdom of Buddhist teachings, like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, to navigate the complexities of modern life? Think about the challenges you face. Where could a little more mindfulness, compassion, and understanding make a difference? Keep exploring, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.